Welcome, everyone, to a very special episode of hashtag Real Talk with Aaron Bragg. This special holiday episode because we're going to be doing a little bit of charity work. This is the one I do every year. And also, I am very, very excited to have my CISO finally on the podcast. It was one of those things, Scott. I have to do a little sidebar because Jim always bugged me. He's like, have you asked Scott to do this? I'm like, Scott's always busy, always busy. He's like, just ask him to do it and give him enough time to book for it and he'll do it. So finally, we got this taken care of. For those listeners who may not know him, Scott is the Chief Information Security Officer for Corewell Health. Corewell Health is based here out of my hometown of Grand Rapids, and we are a top 15 healthcare system, I think, top 15.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. The topic today is CISO Insights, lessons learned in the healthcare security journey. Scott, introduce yourself to the listeners and tell me how you got into the wonderful world that is information security.
Oh, sure. Sure. Scott Dresen, Chief Information Security Officer for Corewell Health. I have been in healthcare IT my whole career, so 30 plus years now in total. I started out very early in my undergrad days working for a company that made software for operating rooms, resource scheduling, and resource management systems. And that was sort of my entree into healthcare IT as a profession, which at the time I had no thought at all that that was a viable career path. Didn't even understand it, and so been very happy since then. So my career has led me through from being an application analyst all the way up to being a chief technology officer and then into my CISO world. So I've sort of run the gamut across all different types of healthcare organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, academic, you name it. I've sort of had some experience in those realms. So in the mid teens, probably 2015 or so, working for what was back then Spectrum Health, which was one of the two entities that came together to form Corewell Health more recently with Beaumont. But in 2015 or so, we had needed to sort of shift our focus on security for the organization because healthcare was lagging behind other sectors in their application of security. And our CIO at the time came to me and said, I think we need to supersize our InfoSec program and make it a position that reports directly to me as CIO and get it more board level visibility. So that was sort of the genesis of the sort of version 2.0 of our InfoSec program. We hired a CISO in 2016 at the beginning of that program once we got board approval for it. And then after he left the organization in 2018, I was asked to sort of step in and assume that role and continue on in my CTO role at the same time, sort of wearing both hats. So that's sort of what led me to be in my current CISO role, where I've been in this position for over 6 years now, at least 7 in March.
Yes, it is. All right, I'm going to take you back in time a little bit because you just talked about like the big reboot that we did. And shout out to Patrick O'Hare. Who'd have thought that some of the ideas that he had back in 2016 would like still help set the foundation of where we're at today. So back in 2016, when you were the technology officer and you talked about this reboot, what were some of your biggest challenges and frustrations back then?
I think, like I said earlier, that healthcare was trying to catch up. I think the nature of information security threats was really starting to shift in the teens, back in the days of script kiddies and, more novel types of attacks to far more coordinated and organized threats. And, I think now that we're looking back historically, we probably understand it was even more significant now than we even understood at the time. So it was good we were making that shift. But so the scope and the scale of what we needed to change and how quickly we needed to do it to advance our program maturity was certainly a significant challenge. And, that came with a significant budget that we needed to, pitch to our board of directors to get the buy-in to fund the initiative, and the reasons behind it, which we did. We had a lot of organizational support. So I was very thankful for that. But that forced us to have to rethink, our entire information security delivery model and how we were organized to manage information security as a discipline. What kind of resources would we need? How should we be structured? And then, how did we do organizational change management to reset expectations in the broader org around the role of information security? For years, we were always sort of perceived as the team that says no, and we're always the gate through which you had to pass before anything could proceed. And so to get our organization to shift its frame of mind to think about information security as a risk and to treat it as a risk-based decision that we would have to make was another shift that took us several years to get through, to the point of the business understanding where they could accept risk and where they couldn't deflect that responsibility they had from a business decision making perspective on security, that we were there to partner with them and could help inform them, but it ultimately we were advising on risk and risk-based decisions. We weren't accepting responsibility necessarily to make those decisions for the business. So those are a couple of the types of challenges that we had back then to advance our program.
Because I remember those beginning days because it was that sign off mentality, right? Like the business wanted you to tell them what to do and to
Yeah.
sign off, like for better, for worse for this. So let's fast forward 2 years. In 2018, you had the chance to assume the dual role, right, of the CTO and the CISO. And sometimes, I even saw it with you because I worked with you on 2016 and some of the Mercury and Gemini projects. And I saw some of the challenges that you had then when you were just the CTO. Fast forward 2 years, now you're assuming the dual role, right? And sometimes you have that inherent conflict. What was the hardest thing that you had to change and overcome, knowing that you had that dual role and sometimes it was conflicting? Because I thought you did a pretty good job. Well, actually, you did do a good job.
Well, thank you. It was certainly challenging, having two very different team cultures between information security and the infrastructure teams, sort of early on to try and create a more singular, unified culture that brought those groups together, was certainly a challenge early in those days, as you may recall. And some of the traditional, adversarial relationships that exist between information security and infrastructure, having a single point of accountability, I appreciated that role because it allowed me to break down some of those barriers that existed between the teams that historically had been more challenging. When we hired our first CISO in 2016, he and I had a lot of similar ideas and thoughts and perspectives, and were aligned on our strategy and where we needed to head. And so that collaboration and commitment to work together and partner was really effective between us, but it didn't necessarily equate to our teams being quite as closely aligned as that person and I were. So having the singular accountability for both teams sort of allowed me to take it to that next level and to make those bridges even more effective between the teams, so we could break down the barriers, because I became a single point of decision making when it was necessary to help prioritize and make decisions that worked to the advantage of both teams. So I don't think I ever needed to make a decision that was, in favor of one team, that was not to the advantage of another. But I could make some of those philosophical and leadership based decisions that were necessary to advance our program.
Which would come definitely in handy because obviously you got that role in the beginning part of 2018. And then the summer of 2018, well, actually late spring, you were charged with, okay, finishing some of the things up that were kind of, hanging Chad, so to speak, a little election pun,
Hmm.
with the security program because we were 2.5 years into that 5-year journey. Right. And then you came up with some just do it's, right? Because we had
Yeah.
a lot of projects going on. There were so many iron in the fire because there was so much to take into account that we had to fix. You came up with the concept of, like these just do it's, and which led to like our fire up project, which is, egress filtering, which would obviously become a wonderful thing later on. But you had the foresight to say, okay, hey, for something like this with firewall upgrades and other security initiatives, you basically sat us down like, okay, we had a crack team, we had a special room, and you're just like, you like two kids, right? Get along, get it done. And that end up being a great thing because it started that journey to, lo and behold, later in the summer of 2018 and the wonderful WannaCry situation that really, really caused a lot of havoc, right? But it
Hmm.
set things
Hmm.
up to where you were able to do two things, right? You were able to show how you can be proactive, right? Because we had done some things to help mitigate some of the damage, but it was also that kind of like a wake up call for areas of the business to be like, wow, this isn't Scott just, saying FUD these last couple years. Like that was major, major stuff. Um, in that you had to make some tough decisions. You had to, explain to, business leaders, our new CEO at the time, I think wasn't Tina. Tina was only like just a couple months into into her journey.
That or just about to take it because our former CIO was still in place when that event happened. So
Okay.
because he
Okay.
retired at the same time as our former CEO, Tina was probably named at that point, but they might still have been transitioning the prior CEO out before Tina assumed her role. Yeah. Yeah. So
What were those
um,
discussions like, right? Like you had to get into rooms with high level clinical and business leaders and explain to them like what was going on in your head when you had explained the
yeah.
seriousness of the situation.
Well, let me answer that in two parts because I'll go back to your first questions prior to the event just to give it a little bit more background on the when I took over as CISO and CTO at that point in time, we did an offsite with my leaders and we had some real direct, productive, and effective conversations around roles and responsibilities. So, where there had been ambiguity in the past around, for example, where does firewall administration take place? Who actually is going to do that? Who's responsible for it? Who makes the policy decisions? Who actually does the work to implement and manage the devices? Things at that tactical level. We actually walked through our whole service catalog and got really clear where there was any ambiguity or confusion as to who was doing what amongst the infrastructure and or infosec leaders, so we were clear on which team was on point for a service. So that was really helpful because we had really productive discussions and everyone came into the dialogue with a really positive frame of mind, so it wasn't adversarial in any sense of the word. Another thing we had done is we had engaged a third party consultant to come in and have an offsite with us for several days where we looked at our original infosec sort of strategy that we had started in 2016. um, but at that point in 2018, we wanted to sort of reset and say, okay, where are we at on this journey, this 5-year journey? To your point, we were almost halfway through that period, and we wanted to say, okay, how are we on path with the pace we thought we would have when we started this, or do we need to reprioritize, the work that is yet to do to make sure we're doing the right things for the right reasons and make better risk-informed decisions? So we used this third-party consulting firm, one of the well-known big fours, to help us, and that was a really productive discussion because that helped us reset our strategy from a prioritization perspective. So things like those just do it's sort of, I think, had come out of those workshops to say these are things we can do right now to be really effective. We don't need to belabor decision making, but it'll set us up to move to the next iteration of this strategy that is going to be harder work to do and take a little bit more effort. So all those sort of components and things we were doing in that time frame really, I think, help establish the culture. It helps break down more of the barriers that existed between the infrastructure and infrastructure teams. And we got validation because we had this third party consulting firm telling us, hey, we've never seen groups as effectively working together between these two traditionally adversarial domains as we're seeing in this organization. So it reinforced for me that we were definitely on the right path with what we were doing. And I'm really happy that we did it at the time. And I will follow back up on this with a comment later on in our discussion as we got to the point of creating Corewell and having to revisit that decision around those two roles. So, but I'll save that. I'll give you a teaser and we'll talk about it later. But uh, back to the second half of your question in the context of the WannaCry, to set it up a little bit for the listeners, we had an HVAC vendor who sent us the device that came with the ransomware embedded already on it. Thankfully for us, we were far enough into the WannaCry global incident that the variant that was on the device was old. However, to Aaron, to your points, we had already done some things like the egress filtering where we were blocking all outbound connections that that's how we noticed and detected the virus that was the malware that was trying to propagate across our infrastructure. Is we were seeing it trying to make connection attempts outbound that were being blocked at our perimeter because we had put those controls in place. And then we were able to quickly assemble an incident response team to address the situation. So, to the questions in the dialogue we were having, obviously our senior executives, as part of our incident response process, are very much involved in these types of incidents. And that was certainly probably one of the first, if not the first, most significant type of incident. Although, again, in retrospect, it had very little impact to the organization that it could have otherwise had it been a more current strain of the virus, and or if we had not had some of the protective controls we'd had in place to prevent it from phoning home, so to speak, and activating. So we did have some, internal systems that were on older operating systems that were knocked over as the malware was attempting to access them, but it wasn't successful. But it still blue screened the devices. But our endpoint detection and response platform at the time was detecting the malware and addressing it. So we had a lot of controls in place that were helping us mitigate it. But to your point, in going through this exercise and responding to it and providing updates to senior leadership as we were going through the incident, it certainly did, I think, provide a great example of the type of incident that could happen, that could manifest into something far more impactful and damaging to the organization had it been, like I said, a more current strain that potentially had been allowed to phone home. We could have been in a much worse situation. And I think in the years since that event, we have seen, unfortunately, many occurrences of this type of event happening to organizations where it hit them in the worst way possible, and they've been devastated as a result. And it's really frustrating to see it happening still. Knowing that we're trying to, the core of our mission is to try and help our community, and to have to fight and defend ourselves against threat actors from halfway across the globe who are trying to do us harm when we're trying to do nothing but good for our community is can be very frustrating. But I appreciate the quality and the skill of our teams to be able to help protect our organizations to keep that from happening to us.
Yes, and the little anecdote at the end about that, and I know that you and Jim still laugh about it, is when everything was contained, they kept on seeing obviously the SOC kept on seeing, it pop back up, and then they narrowed it to the printers, right, at
Hmm.
Priority Health. And I still laugh at this story where one of our managers said, well, hey, I still have access over there. I'm gonna go see this. They narrowed it down to the room. Obviously, he walks into this room and it's a whole room full of printers. And to your point
Hmm.
about have talented people, he's like, oh my God, there's 30 or 40 printers in here. How do I know which one's infected? And then one of the engineers is like, hey, let's run a print job to it. And lo and behold, they printed it off. He found that and they unplugged that super quickly. That's still one of my favorite stories from the stressful time that was WannaCry. Um,
Yeah.
all right, we're going to fast forward a couple years because some of this would, as you said, help out with your decision making. Let's fast forward to March, I think 13th or 15th, 2020. Right. And a couple of us, I was just leaving Lakeland at the time when I got the phone call from my leader saying, hey, Scott has decided we're gonna tomorrow, almost all of IT is gonna stay home. We're gonna do a dry run on our VPN to see if we can work from home. Little did we know we would not go back to the office for a little while after that. Can you walk me through some of your thought process that, right? Because this is where I really think that dual role you had really helped us out. So, as you know, in security, it's preparation, but it's also sometimes luck, right? To your point, like the luck of the variant that we got with the WannaCry, but we had done preparation to see if something happens. Fast forward to the 2020, and you had thought about different ways of increasing our VPN, moving to the cloud and everything else. How was it really not that hard to make that decision, that test run? Like, what are some of your initial thoughts when we were embracing that initial work remote?
Yeah, I think we were very fortunate, to your point, luck favors the prepared. We had gone through a couple of, I would say, significant events that helped us helped position us for being able to better respond to the need to send all of our workforce remote because of COVID-19. One was we had, in earlier the prior year, I think, had largely finished our transition and migration over to Office 365. So that having the whole Office 365 ecosystem available to us and the use of Teams for collaboration. We were still, very new to, which feels sort of weird when you say it today because now it's like second nature. But having all these teleconferences with people working remote felt very weird at the time and unusual. And given what was happening with COVID, I think it was a great demonstration of our exercise in incident response as well, because we had a lot of collaboration with the business around decision making around the safety of our staff, and given what they knew clinically from what they were seeing around the globe with the spread of COVID and the potential impacts, the need to get people out of the facilities who didn't need to be there to help protect them and reduce the likelihood of the disease transmission was significant. I recall, the first several days that over that weekend of March 13th, when we first made that decision to send people remote, we were in the command centers, and even then we were in a compressed state and having dialogue into the weekend, like we have got to get people out of here and get distance, because the way this COVID-19 is transmitted across people, as easily as it was at the time, the more we were contained in a small tight space, we were increasing the likelihood that a lot of our core leadership who were responding to this event and organizing it could potentially get infected, and that could be really problematic. So it was a great collaboration in the incident response process to take the operational context of what was happening, and then how do we apply the technology and security controls. Well, we had already addressed our Office 365 for productivity for a lot of the knowledge workers that needed to go remote. We had the capacity in Microsoft 365 to increase our use of Teams because it wasn't dependent on on-premises based technology that was limited in capacity. The other thing that happened to our advantage was, and not unusual for West Michigan, we had several winters, prior to 2020 that were pretty intense. One of them I recall we called Snowmageddon because schools were out for over a week. And we, because of those snow events, had a lot of people working remote at the time and had to increase our VPN capacity for that remote work. So all that prep work, because of those snowstorms, had allowed us to increase the infrastructure in our on-prem environment to accommodate far more remote workers than we might have otherwise been prepared for. So when it came time to send 7 or 8,000 people home at the beginning of COVID, which I think was the numbers we sent home, we did have to increase capacity of our VPN capabilities, but we could do it through virtualization and scale out to accommodate the added load. And we watched it really carefully, but it worked out really well. And we didn't have a whole lot of impact around people not having an ability to work remote. And then we turned our attention towards trying to figure out how to use some of our remote access capabilities, like Teams, for example, to create those personal patient connections for families who had loved ones in the hospitals that were at that point in time being
I
refused
remember that.
entry. Yeah, because of the threat of the transmission, and so much was unknown yet. So, working with some of our colleagues in digital services to get Teams enabled on an ad hoc basis with patients who are in, near death circumstances, so their family could say goodbye before they passed. It was a really emotional time for the support teams who were trying to facilitate those types of connections from patient to family in a remote way. So a lot of really great lessons learned and experiences and coming together to figure out those problems, because we understood the impact of us being able to make those connections for families in that time of need.
Still gets it. What's funny is
Yeah.
that still gets me choked up, and it's been almost 5 years now. How crazy is that? So
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
reward, right, from the executive leadership would be the next year, or no, it was almost 2 years, year and 18 months or something like that. Is be like,
Yeah.
hey, we're gonna do a come together, and we're gonna create a new company. You've had the distinct pleasure, notice I'm doing pleasure in air quotes, of being both part of small, mergers and acquisitions, and then this one, right? So a
Yeah.
two-part question for you. Were you able to take some of the lessons learned from like the integration with Lakeland, right, the Southwestern Michigan stuff, and apply it right, to the larger one. And what is something, what's a good lesson learned now that, we've gone live? We're knock on wood in a stable spot right now. So take me back in time to 21 and 22.
Yeah, I think, if I look back retrospectively, the Spectrum Health, since I joined in 2007, had been doing, a merger and acquisition activity almost once every 2 years, whether it was the extension expansion of our medical group or the acquisition of small community hospitals in different parts of Michigan. And like you said, it wasn't until 2018, roughly, that we did an integration of fairly significantly larger size in the Lakeland Health integration. And when the Beaumont integration came about, we were still working through the Lakeland integration. We hadn't finished that yet. And that gave the organization time to think about the best way to continue forward with the Lakeland integration while at the same time contemplating the new Beaumont integration, which was, essentially an organization of equivalent size, which was a whole different scale than we were used to. But at the core, I think our experience having gone through those smaller mergers and acquisitions was really good and helpful because it gave us a framework from which we could work that we knew we had done before successfully. We just had to figure out how to scale it up and what those scalability issues might be, that are different at that size than they would at a smaller organization. And so, I think really being clear on our integration business objectives and the timing for those objectives really helped us because it set the expectation of, and as you well know, the pace for integration within between Beaumont and Spectrum Health was aggressive because we needed to fully integrate to realize the benefit of coming together as opposed to just bringing two organizations together and continuing to operate somewhat autonomously. That was not what we had intended to do. So I think creating those expectations early on, what those business objectives and requirements are, really helped you frame how to prioritize and focus on the most important work, which certainly impacted us as we did our integration over the last 2.5 or now almost 3 years. I think being respectful of the culture of organizations that you're integrating and taking a more human-centered approach to that integration, because there's a lot of change taking place, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it can create a lot of anxiety for teams that becomes really distracting for people to be able to make forward progress because they're really worried about what's in it for me and what's the impact to me and my family. And while you always are going to have tough decisions to make in those integrations and never can promise that everything is going to remain unchanged, I think taking a human-centered approach is the most pragmatic and empathetic way to approach these because you can have open dialogues and discussions and be respectful while you're doing it to help relieve some of the tension. You can't get rid of it all, but to help manage that so you can really focus your teams on what you need to do to drive the integration in a productive and effective way, because that's going to be your best chance to preserve as much as you can for all the people who will be affected in the process. And then, understand your risk posture, including all of the risks that come into it with a new integration, and sort of the proverbial walking into it with your eyes wide open. I know some of our early merger and acquisition activity, we went in pretty quickly without as much focus on information security risk as we should have had. And I remember early in our journey, long before our significant security program push in 2015 and 2016, we acquired an entity that when we went in and started evaluating the technology environment, realized it was riddled with malware all over their server infrastructure. And we hadn't slowed down enough to seek and look for those types of risks before we completed the acquisition. And so the experiences like that really informed our approach to integrations, really up until this day, where we look at some really key things like, do you have multi-factor authentication enabled for all of your internet facing services? If you don't, it's a requirement to get that done before we complete the integration. What what are your other encryption and security controls you have in place? And where might there be risks that we need to elevate and escalate depending on the materiality of that risk to the integration team, so there's awareness. What are your internet facing services like, and do you have major vulnerabilities in those platforms because you haven't patched them recently enough? We've made integration requirements, patching of of known vulnerabilities. So those things are closed and dealt with before we complete the integration, so that we don't take on that risk in the new organization, and it's addressed before the acquisition completes. So, understanding your risk posture and the risk profile of the acquiring entities from both directions is really important. And then lastly, I think having a really solid overall information technology strategy can really help you. I know in the more recent integration that we have done to form Corewell, we had gone through with the Lakeland integration, the transition of our ERP platform from Lawson to Workday. We had already integrated them into O365. We were well on our journey to integrating them into a common Epic instance, which was a long-term objective of our Corewell Health integration program. And so all those sort of strategies were already set in place and moving forward. And that really helped us sort of use those existing work efforts and just amplify them to increase the scale and scope to accommodate an organization the size of Beaumont as we work to figure out what our long-term strategy was going to be for our enterprise technology plans. So got a
What's
lot of good
nice
lessons
is,
learned.
again, your CTO experience comes into play. I got
Yeah.
one word that's helped us many, many times: XNet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that
Segmentation is your
infrastructure, XNet is your friend. All
Yeah.
right. So let's go forward a little bit. Let's get into 2023. You had a chance to speak in front of Congress around healthcare security. I know that your entire team was both nervous, excited for you, but like us, also nervous because we know we have some pretty interesting personalities in Congress.
Mhm.
Walk me through like how you felt in the moment. Like, what was like your biggest surprise? What were you not surprised about? What were you surprised? What did surprise you? And then what would you have done differently?
Sure. Um, so our we had at the time we had a new government affairs vice president who had previously worked on Carl Levin's staff when he was senator for Michigan. Um, and when she joined our organization, she still has a lot of relationships with the existing elected official staffs, across the board from the Senate to the House and others. And so, um, Senator Gary Peters is the chair of the committee I spoke to. And I think because of that, he was interested in getting a healthcare leader from the state of Michigan on the panel that I spoke with. And so I'd had what was presented to me initially is, hey, can you just talk to these congressional staffers for 30 minutes? They have some questions for you about cybersecurity and the impact on healthcare in the U.S. And so I said, sure, happy to have the dialogue. What I learned later, and I shouldn't have been as naive in answering yes, although it wouldn't have changed my answer, was that was an interview for going in front of this committee. It wasn't just I want to talk to you for 30 minutes on a whim kind of thing, because I found out they had spoken with several other healthcare leaders around the state asking similar questions, and so I think that contributed to me being part of this committee presentation, which I was grateful and happy to do. Um, I had a lot of collaboration and help from the American Hospital Association. Shout out to John Ridgey, who's the cybersecurity advisor for the AHA. Former FBI, CIA agent for 30 plus years, and now the cybersecurity advisor for the American Hospital Association, was really helpful in connecting me, as was our government affairs vice president, with AHA folks who could help prep me for the hearing. And so the day before the hearing, I actually met with them and we talked through all the committee members who are on the committee, what questions they might want to ask, issues that were of concern to them that I needed to be aware of. The committee had already been receiving, or I'm sorry, the committee had already been sending the AHA questions, asking what should we ask during this hearing, what would be appropriate to ask. So the AHA was feeling those. So we actually had a chance to influence some of the questions that they were going to ask me during the
Know
hearing.
that.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of this process, because there is a collaboration, I think, between these groups, nonprofit agencies, and other NGOs that interact with Congress to talk through these issues and position questions. And so several of the senators on the committee had sent the AHA and said, "Hey, we do want to ask this question, so we want him to be prepared to answer it." So that was helpful. But then we also had another set of questions that we were anticipating might be asked that I was going to try and have some ready responses to should they come up. And so overall, in my experience, about half of the questions I was asked by the committee, I was prepared to answer and sort of knew they were coming or expected they might be coming. But the other half of the questions that I got asked, I had no idea they were coming. And that was a little bit more challenging because then you're on the spot having to come up with answers in a reasonable way, given your time limited in your time to respond and interact with the senator, because they're each only given 7 minutes to interact with the people on the panel, and there was three others on the panel besides me. So, looking back, I think if I were to do anything different, it would be have a little bit more time for preparation. From the time I was asked if I could actually present to the actual hearing was about a week. And
Oh
so I
wow.
had,
I didn't
yeah,
realize it was that short. Holy
oh
cow.
yeah,
Then
yeah,
you did good, but you did
yeah,
really, really
yeah,
good.
yeah. So I had to prepare a 5 minute, statement or prepared statement that I would read. That prepared statement is given to all of the senators ahead of time, so they have it and they know. But it's part of the congressional record, is why I say it out loud. So I read that part, and then each panelist has 7 minutes to interact with. I'm sorry, each senator on the committee has 7 minutes to interact with the panel to ask them questions, whatever it is they want to ask about. So I think having a little bit more time to prep for the panel, I might have planned for some of the questions that I was asked that I hadn't prepared for because I didn't think they'd be asked. One in particular I got asked about was China, and do we track, is China attacking us and how do we manage it? I had not been prepared for that question at all. And in retrospect, you look back and you're like, well, why wouldn't you? Of course you would expect you'd be asked a question like that, but I wasn't ready for it, and I had to come up with an answer in the moment. I thought I did pretty good, and everyone said I did, so
You
it
you
was all
you
right.
did pretty good.
Yeah,
Basically, this is why you're the CISO and I'm not, because I literally I think it was or Congressman Hall here or somebody, and I would have been like,
yeah. Holly
"What do
did ask
you
that
think?"
question. Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I literally would have said, "Well, duh." And
yeah,
there's a reason why I am not the CISO. So again, no, though that's great insight, and the fact that you only had like 1 week to prepare, because we all thought like this had been in the works forever. So you really knocked it out of the
yeah.
park.
No, no.
All right. So a little later on in 2023, you were presented with I wouldn't say fallout, but the revelation, and I wouldn't even say revelation because you and Jim and a little bit of Augie before we left kind of knew some of the AI stuff was coming, but obviously, end of 2022, really seeing it explode. And then some of the questions that come up for it. So, like, what was the hardest part of planning and implementing, security around artificial intelligence last year?
Well, I think my answers are going to be the same this year as they were last year, but part of it is it's a bit of a paradox in the context that AI, in some respects, is just another technology. So, in some ways, you can look at it and say, well, the problem domain is a little bit different, but it's not a whole lot different than having to secure our data from other environments that we have to deal with. But that I think is an oversimplification, to be really honest. So I've stopped using that as an answer as I learn more, because the reality of AI is what is most astonishing to me about it is the pace of change and advancement of the technology, and then its adoption by users. And so our ability to understand how it's working, to appreciate what are the risks, then how do you determine security strategies to manage those risks is really challenging because it's moving so quickly. It's hard to stay in front of that pace, and then to some degree even harder to figure out how do you then control and manage it, because people are adopting and using this technology far faster than we're able to manage and control it. So we had to do, to some degree, some draconian things, like initially blocking all access to AI from our corporate network, except those who were allowed to use it, because we needed to sort of get an understanding as to how might it be used, what would the risks of that use be, and then what's the implication of that risk to our organization. What does it mean? And so, absent really understanding it, we just had to block it. Now we've got a more structured governance program in place now to manage it, so that as people have requests to use AI, they represent a business case to support why they're asking for access, and then we can make decisions based on business value to allow those exceptions or not. And we're doing that, and so that process is, I think, working well. I think to some degree we're still trying to understand exactly how to secure data within the AI ecosystem. And I was at Microsoft last week with some peers, and we were talking with Microsoft a lot about their use of AI, and you see the adoption and the capabilities they're developing, that we're starting to contemplate how do we take advantage of that to derive the business value it would offer to us. It's astonishing how quickly they're creating some really impressive tools, and not just them. There's lots of other entities and organizations that are doing it. I was in a meeting early this morning about the adoption of a cloud technology we're putting in place for software development, and the incorporation of secure coding capabilities to help improve the quality of the code, but make it reduce the friction it takes for developers to apply secure coding principles to their development work. So the tool is helping support it and accelerate their work, not slow them down and be a hindrance to it. So I think managing and understanding where the data is flowing within AI, and then where is that data going to get to a point of becoming a potential risk for our organization, so that we aren't unintentionally exposing something. So two examples I would offer you: one are things like when you have what was at the time the Bing chat for enterprises, which applied, one of the early initiatives from Microsoft. There were security controls Microsoft had put in place to potentially sort of encapsulate your data so that it didn't get incorporated into their large language model from a development perspective, and that helped address our concerns around the risk of unintentional sensitive data exposure. But at the same time, their tool was using the broader internet as a source for searching for answers for queries. And so we had to be concerned that, well, if you put something into your prompt for the AI asking it a question and include sensitive data, there's a possibility it's going to send that out to a broader general internet search engine, looking for an answer that might, again, unintentionally expose you to sensitive data exposure that you don't want. So those kinds of things can be really challenging to sort of peel the onion back to figure out where is it, so that we can enable a business but not introduce new risk to it. So that, I think, is still an ongoing challenge for us.
All right. Run up against it, and I got a couple more that I want to squeeze in before we have to let you go. Now let's talk
Okay.
about your leadership style. One of my absolute favorite things around your style is that you always try and, when you can, take the time to explain things. This approach obviously is not common in, higher level leadership, as it should be, right? Especially we have a, younger generation that isn't as kind of hardened as the older generation. What advice, I guess I'll do a quick situation before I actually ask you the question. So when I was part of the setting up the AI policy, right, we had a small team, privacy, legal, myself and others building it. And I got excited on trying to get a couple messaging across, right? But the level of the messaging, or the level at some of this messaging was going to be like at the highest levels, and caused a little consternation, right? Instead of that could have been a moment where you could have, like, scolded, even after all these years working together, right? You could have politely slapped my hand or scolding and stuff like that. You actually took the time to, you said, hey, you got a minute, you do a quote, we did a probably a 10-15 minute call, and you walked through why things needed to be this way. You didn't have to, right? But you did. But that's one of the examples of how, why you're so endeared. And we do have a low turnover. We have turnover. Everybody in security has turnover, but we have pretty good numbers when it comes to that. What are some advice you can give to other leaders to help them better connect with their teams in the way that you do?
That can be hard, because sometimes, for people who do things, if it comes to some degree somewhat naturally, trying to teach it and explain it can be also challenging. So I often ask myself this question to, when I get asked what you're asking me. So hopefully my answer will be something that resonates with you. I think one of the core, and you hear me say this all the time, and so it's sort of a mantra, and I get teased about it by peers, but I'm always asking the question, what problem are we trying to solve? because I find, and I've learned over the years of studying, lean thinking and process improvement, that really seeking to understand the core of the problem, you're going to ultimately be able to develop a solution to address that problem far faster than if you just start solutioning without really appreciating the underlying problem that really is at the root of whatever it is you're trying to solve. So that, the measure twice, cut once approach versus, measure once, cut a mistake, and then having to, start over, is problematic and inefficient. And so to some degree, it's in our culture, it's not usual to think that way. We're also quick to want to jump to solution, like, "Oh, I know what the problem is," and you make assumptions, and invariably find yourself at times finding those assumptions are incorrect for whatever reason, and having to reapproach it from a different perspective, when if you had taken more time up front to really truly understand the problem and to think through how you might address that problem, you'll probably get to a solution faster that's more effective at the end of the day. So it's sort of starting with that, really trying to seek to understand the problem. So I'm always challenging myself: what problem are we trying to solve, and can I really understand it? Because the other thing that does a lot is help you interact with the business in a way, because if you really understand the source of the problem, then you're much more likely to understand the value the business is trying to seek, that's put you in a position of asking about this problem in the first place. And by doing that, you're going to engender a lot of trust from your business partners, because you're going to be speaking in language they understand. You're going to be speaking about benefits that they want to realize out of whatever problem you're trying to solve together, from their point of view, through the lens that they look at the issue, not from the traditional back office technology point of view. I'm building a widget, and I'm going to build this thing in my way. And if the user doesn't understand it, well, then they're just clearly stupid. That's never the case. That's never the case. That's just, yeah, in any event. So focusing on that core of that problem, and then, as part of that journey, and going through that discovery of understanding what the problem is and identifying what the gaps are, seeking sharing your perspective as to, here's what I'm thinking and why I'm thinking it. Now, I admittedly do this for two reasons. One is, it's how I think. I think out loud, and so I will tell you how I think, because in part I'm seeking feedback to see if what I'm saying resonates with you, and or if you have other ideas that I haven't thought about that might sway me to think about something differently. So it's part of my nature, and how I think is part of it. But the other part is, if you don't understand how I'm thinking, and I give you a direction, or make a decision, and it doesn't make sense to you, I've missed an opportunity to advance your own understanding of the problem space as I see it. And you may not understand why we're doing something, and that could decrease the effectiveness of our response, if you don't understand it, don't understand the why, or don't agree with it. And that can become problematic. And so creating that culture of transparency of thought, and saying, here's how I'm looking at this and why, helps me think through the problem better. And I think it hopefully helps our team members understand some of the decisions we make that might otherwise, without that explanation, be a mystery, and to some degree potentially frustrating for them.
110% to everything that you said. Okay. One last question before I let you go. Well, I got to give you some good news at the end, but heading into 2025, what advice do you have for other healthcare security leaders as they face challenge, tighter budgets, smarter threat actors, changing business strategies, value streams? You know this. That's the hotness for
Yeah.
2025. Business value streams. So what advice do you have? Because I think you and like Jim and Claudia have done a really good job of literally flipping the script going into next year. And I know personally it's going to challenge me to think a little bit differently. And I love challenges because you're learning. If you're learning, if you're not learning, you're falling behind. What advice do you have to security leaders out there for 2025?
Well, I think the first thing I would suggest is, be brilliant at the basics. It's table stakes, to do the more complex work in an organization. And if you're not good at it, you're not going to engender the trust and have the political capital you need to tackle the more challenging problems in your environments. And if you look at the threat landscape, and you look at the organizations that have actually faced compromises, how many of them have faced a compromise that could have been easily prevented? And I'm not casting stones at those entities. We live in a very complex world. We have a lot of complex organizations, but to have, a point of access on the internet that isn't protected by MFA, or you haven't applied, critical patches that the vendor has said are going to address a vulnerability that's known to be exploited on the internet, things like that. Those are fundamentals that we need to be really, really good at to help protect our organization. And there's anecdotally, I've heard that the top 3 or 4 controls in the CIS control framework will mitigate 85+% of the risk any organization might have. So, if you have basic asset inventories, software inventories, data inventories, and you're putting some of those basic controls in place, you can deal with the vast majority of your risk right there. And so then you focus increasingly on the smaller elements of risk that are more difficult to address. So being brilliant at the basics, I think, is more important than ever. Understanding the risks of your business and how to effectively engage with your business to talk about and manage those risks in language that they understand. So back to my, what problem you're trying to solve statement. I think understanding the context of the business you operate in and the risks they face. I hear so many times people reference cybersecurity as a risk, and I'm working and educating my own, peers and other leaders in the organization to realize that cybersecurity is not a risk per se; it's a threat. And if that threat is realized into an exploitation of a vulnerability or some other weakness, and then you have business impact, that's the risk. So what's the business impact? We're going to have some kind of operational impact where we have downtime, short to long-term financial impact, legal, regulatory obligations, brand impact, things like that. That's the risk. It's the risk of operational outage, the risk of financial loss, et cetera. So being able to talk about that in the context the business understands is going to advance your ability to manage that risk, because then you can translate how you manage that risk into cost and the cost to mitigate. And that's really, at the end of the day, what drives a lot of business decision making. And then, leverage your professional and peer community to collaborate, to share threat intelligence, to share best practices, to learn from each other, both in the good times when you've done something well that others are trying to do, and in the bad times when you've had others that are near you that have gone through a bad experience. You can learn from them to help you figure out, how do I prevent that from happening in my organization? And so I think, because of the nature of the threat landscape we live in nowadays, we are entirely in a defensive posture, and have to defend our organizations. We are not going to be going on the offensive to try and attack those who are trying to do harm to us. We need our government to do that for us and to create, real meaningful risk and consequence for what they're doing to us. But in the meantime, we need to work together as best we can to share information and not look at information security as a competitive differentiator. So I'm thankful in our healthcare community in the state of Michigan, we've made that conscious decision years ago that we will collaborate on cybersecurity, because it collectively helps raise the maturity of the healthcare sector overall in the state. And we're not going to look at it as a competitive differentiator that would otherwise prevent us from collaborating in a more productive way. So thankful for that with peers. And I found that elsewhere with peers across the country too. It's not unique to Michigan, but everything starts local. So I'm happy to have it here.
Which is true, because a lot of people when we're out doing community events and stuff like that, or sharing information, I've had people ask like, hey, you talk about this with, say, Gordon Food Service or like Amway, and these are, for listeners, these are local, fairly sized big companies. And I have to remind people that, hey, Gordon Food Service may supply us food, right? So if there's an attack on Gordon Food Service, that's a supply chain attack, right? So we're a pretty
Mhm.
tight knit community. So we want to just as much protect Gordon Food Service, because they could be supplying food for our patients. All right. So finally,
Yeah.
I want to say thank you, and the leadership team, for allowing us to do stuff like the podcast, the different community events. Tomorrow I'll be emceeing a panel on resiliency at C3 Tech Summit. The podcast itself has raised over $17,000 for charities in the years I've been doing it. If you include the broader work that you and Jim and back in the day Augie have let us do, the Cloud Security Alliance is coming up on raising $75,000 over the last 5 years
Oh,
for
that's fabulous.
charities in the community. So I'm very happy to say, when this
Congratulations.
one's going to be released, it is the holiday episode. We're going to be donating money to North Kent Connect and Toys for Tots. So we're recording this in November, but it will be my special holiday episode in December. So I cannot thank you guys enough. We would not be able to do the things that we do for the community without your support.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and I'm very thankful for all that you do for the community because the advocacy, the sharing, the podcasts, the local events, the support at the conferences, you do a lot of really good work to advance security and advance the health of our community. So I thank you for all that you do on behalf of our patients and communities because it makes a difference.